Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. This demonstration is going to walk you through how to make a color bias wheel. This is a complex color wheel that's really based on this idea that every primary color actually has a bias, or it's biased towards one side of the color wheel or another. This is why you have two different kinds of red, two different kinds of yellow, and two different kinds of blue in your class supply list. This accounts for the fact that every red either leans towards orange or leans towards purple. Every yellow either leans towards orange or leans towards green. And every blue leans towards purple or green. In this process, y'all will be mixing your secondary colors like green, orange, and purple. And you'll also be mixing your tertiary colors, which are those colors that lie in between your secondary colors and your primary colors, such as yellow-orange, red-purple, and blue-green. So each primary, secondary, and tertiary color will actually be mixed into hues, tints, tones, shades, and even into tint tones, which are basically a combination of a tint and a tone. Take a moment to familiarize yourself with the definitions of these terms. Hue is the dominant wavelength of color in a given pigment. So when you have a tube of red paint, the hue is going to be that pigment, which is, that nice saturated pigment which is on the tube. A tint is that color that has been lightened with white. So if you take that red out of the tube and you mix white with it. A shade is a color that has been darkened with chromatic black or other dark pigments. This would be a dark red made by mixing that red paint with a chromatic black or a dark brown. A tone is going to be a color that's been neutralized by mixing in a small amount of the complement. A complementary color is the color that is opposite a given hue on the color wheel. So the complementary color to a primary red is going to be green. So I would make a tone of red by mixing a little bit of green with my red. This helps to neutralize the color to make it a little bit less saturated, less bright, and make it appear a little bit more like an earth tone. Let's get started. So the first step is going to be to draw a series of rings on a piece of canvas paper. We're going to need 5 rings, which is going to allow us to separate each ring into your hue, your tint, your shade, and also your tones. So you can either use a compass or you can find a bunch of circular random objects around your house and trace around them, as long as they're varying sizes and will work for the size of your paper. If you're the kind of person who likes to be extremely measured and is a fan of doing math, then I encourage you to use a compass and be very specific about your measurements. So I know that we need to separate this ring or this circle into 15 triangles. So I'm practicing this on the piece of glass with a dry erase marker first so that I kind of know how to approach it. So the first step is going to be to separate your overall circle into 3 parts. Ideally, these are 3 even parts. Then I'm going to separate each of these 3 parts into 5 parts. Once I'm finished, I should have separated my color wheel into 15 equal pieces. Notice how I've drawn my lines that are a third of the way through, a little bit further out, just to demarcate where my primary colors will go. This is where I'll place both of my reds, both of my yellows, and both of my blues on either side of these lines that extend out. Then I'll have my secondary colors in the middle and my tertiary colors on either side in between the primary color and the secondary color. Once I've practiced this, you can practice this in the sketchbook if you'd like. And then I recommend diving into doing it on your piece of canvas paper. Once I have my color wheel mapped out, I'm then going to label things. I start by placing my primary colors, each a third of the way through the color wheel. Feel free to refer to the color wheel right at the beginning of this video, or you can download a PDF of it to help you figure out exactly how this should be set up. I recommend starting by placing your primary colors. Remember that there will be 2 of each primary color, and those will be a third of the way through. Then I recommend placing the secondaries, which are purple, orange, and green, in the middle, halfway between your primary tones. You'll then have 1 triangle left in between your secondary and primaries to place your tertiary colors, like blue, purple, red, orange, blue, green, etc. Then I recommend labeling where your tints, hues, tones, and shades are going to go and getting set up to paint. I recommend painting on your glass palette and grabbing a cup of water and some nice clean brushes. Having a wet paper towel close by is really helpful for wiping off your brushes. You'll also need your palette knife handy. I recommend starting with your hues that are straight out of the tube. So that will be your primary colors. I'm going to start with my phthalo blue. I'm going to place this on the side of the color wheel that leans towards yellow or leans towards green. You'll notice on the tube of phthalo blue that it says green shade. This is a helpful hint that this color has a bias towards green rather than a bias towards purple, like ultramarine blue. After painting in the hue, which is your color right out of the tube, then we're going to mix a tint by mixing some of that blue into white. Whenever you're mixing your tints, I highly recommend that instead of mixing the white into your color, instead doing the opposite and taking a small amount of your color and mixing it into the white. This way you can slowly add more pigment as you need it without using too much paint and wasting paint. I'm then painting my tint in right next to my phthalo blue. I'm also adding a little bit of my slow dry medium and really blending it into the paint on my palette as I go. Every time I put a new color on my palette, I add slow dry medium to it, which is going to help my paint to stay wet for much, much longer. This is going to modify the transparency of the paint just a bit. It will give it a glossy sheen and it will make it a little bit more transparent. If you want to achieve extremely flat colors, but you're using slow dry medium mixed with your paint, you might need to end up doing 2 coats of paint. For this exercise, I wouldn't worry too much about the transparency or opacity of your paint, as long as you're achieving the colors that you want. Next, I'm going to paint in my red leaning blue. This will be my ultramarine blue, which leans a little bit closer to purple on the color wheel than my phthalo blue. So first thing is I'm going to paint it right out of the tube next to my phthalo blue on the part of the color wheel that leans towards purple. I'm using a flat brush to paint this color wheel. I'm using a flat brush because I have a lot of sharp edges and almost 90-degree angles that I'm trying to get into the nooks and crannies of. Using a small flat brush can be the best way to achieve sharp edges because you can really use the squareness of the brush to your advantage to squeeze into those angular parts of the color wheel. Next, I'm mixing up the tint of my ultramarine blue by mixing a little bit of my ultramarine blue into my white paint. At first, it's not quite dark enough, so I grab a little bit more. Because I'm mixing my pigment into my white, this allows me to slowly modify it until I get to the color that I need. My goal here is to make a light blue color with my ultramarine blue. That being said, it's okay if my color is slightly lighter or darker than yours. We don't need to be perfectionists with this project. Instead, this is all about just getting the experience of trying it out. So don't worry if yours doesn't look exactly like mine. Next thing I do is I paint this tint into the section of the color wheel right above the ultramarine blue hue. Notice how I'm lining up the flat side of my brush very carefully with the flat edge that I'm trying to paint. I'm then pivoting my brush around the curve as I need it. I'm making sure that my brush is very loaded up with color. This is a really important skill to practice early on in learning how to paint. The next thing I'm going to do is pop in my primary reds. So this is going to be my cadmium red and my quinacridone magenta. You can tell just by looking at the colors themselves in the tubes that the quinacridone magenta leans more towards purple and the cadmium red leans more towards orange. So I'm going to take my cadmium red as well as a blob of white, and then I'll add a little bit of my red to my white. Remember that we're always adding the darker color to the lighter color in small increments to get it to where we want. So now I'm mixing up a pink, which is basically a tint of red. Now is the time for me to decide where this should go on the color wheel. Looking at the way things are set up, I notice that I have purple on one side of the reds and orange on the other. Ask yourself which secondary this cadmium red looks a little bit more like. This cadmium red should lean a little bit more towards orange, which means it should be on the right side of those two primaries. My quinacridone magenta leans a little bit more towards purple, so I'll put my quinacridone magenta and its tint right to the left of it. Next, I'm going to move on to my yellows. Here, I make a mistake. I place my hue where the tint should go. When you make a mistake when making this color wheel, take a little bit of white and paint right over top of it. Here, because I was using a very opaque tone, this light yellow, I could paint that directly on top, but sometimes it won't be quite so easy. If you have a transparent color you're painting on top, that will really affect your color. So I recommend, if you make a mistake, take a little bit of pure white paint and just quickly paint over top of the section that you need to bring back to white. I did this several times throughout making this color wheel. I made so many mistakes. So don't be afraid to take a little bit of white paint right on top, and then let it dry, and then move forward. Then I'm going to mix up my secondaries. So to make my green, I'll mix my phthalo blue with my cadmium yellow. I'm mixing it not necessarily in equal parts because my blue is much more powerful than my yellow. It's pretty rare that to make a secondary, you can actually just mix two colors in equal parts. But instead, a lot of hues have really varying intensities. So to make a green, I recommend starting with yellow and then adding little bits of the darker color to the yellow. So adding a little bit of the blue to the yellow until it gets to the green that you desire. From there, I went ahead and made the two tertiary colors while I had my green mixed. So to make my yellow green, I took my middle green, my secondary green, and I added a bit more yellow to it. To make my blue green, I took my middle green, cut it in half, slid it over, and added a little bit more blue to it. Then I popped these into my color wheel and mixed my tints of my secondary and my tertiary colors. At this point in the process, when you're mixing your secondary and tertiary colors, it can be really helpful to first mix up a big enough blob of the kind of mother color, so of your green, so that you can then chop that green blob into 3 parts, slide it across with your palette knife, and then modify it to create your tertiaries. This is a really helpful, important skill. Sometimes having a big enough blob, so maybe about a penny size blob of paint, can be a good place to start, so that you can then almost cut that in half and slide it over so you can create multiple variations of the same color from the same blob of paint. You'll begin to notice as you're painting your tints and hues especially that some of these colors are much more opaque or transparent than others. you'll notice that these hues, especially that yellow-green, is really, really transparent. We can really see the white of the page through it. This means that if there was a different color beneath it, that color would add to this yellow-green, creating a new color. It's really important to consider how transparency and opacity affect the painting that you're trying to make. You'll notice that when we add white to any of these colors, the opacity changes quite a bit. All of these tints are incredibly opaque, and that's because hopefully you've purchased a nice opaque white. They do make transparent whites. However, I think one of the most helpful things about white paint is its ability to transform something into a really opaque color, a color that can cover up the colors beneath it. That being said, there are plenty of applications in which having a beautiful transparent color is really helpful, which we'll learn in your next exercise, where we'll be thinking about using glazes of transparent colors to almost create new tones by mixing colors optically. So why would we want to mix tints? So a tint is that lighter version of a color where you've added white, and tints are incredibly helpful when you're making a painting. Knowing how to make lighter versions of a color allows you to create the illusion of light wrapping around an object through creating gradients of a given color. At this point, I goofed up and I forgot to record painting these purples. Notice how I use my quinacridone magenta mixed with my ultramarine blue to first mix that middle purple and the tint of it, and then I mixed my tertiaries by mixing that purple with the quinacridone magenta and that purple with some ultramarine blue. Next, I move on to my oranges, my final secondary color, and those last tertiaries. I mix up an orange by mixing my cadmium red with my Indian yellow and popping that into the center where I need to paint in my hue. While I'm at it, I mix up my tertiary colors by sliding that blob of paint over, adding a little bit of yellow to my orange, adding a little bit of orange to my yellow, so that I can mix my yellow orange, and then adding a little bit more red to my orange to mix up a red orange. Then I have those 3 variations of orange, and I can pop them right into my color wheel. One fun fact about Indian yellow, about the pigment, is that it originated in India, and at first it was made by feeding mangoes to cows and then making them pee on chalk, and then taking that chalk and creating paint or pigments out of it. It turns out the cows did not like eating these mangoes, so over time these practices stopped, and now Indian yellow or India yellow is made in a lab rather than having cows pee on chalk after eating mangoes. While you're mixing up colors and mixing up these tints, let's talk about the practical applications of mixing tints. Look around you for some kind of cylindrical object. Notice what color that is, and then look closely at how the color shifts as it moves into the light. There are probably areas of this object that are darker. There are probably areas that are lighter and areas that are mid-tone. As you're mixing these tints, imagine how you could use this tint to help you convey that sense of light wrapping around an object. Learning how to paint is really about learning how to see light and shadow and how to interpret it into color. Because light and shadow has a lot to do with value, which is the relative lightness or darkness of something, this means that we need to learn how color relates to value. This is incredibly tricky. As you're looking at your color wheel, you'll probably notice that every single hue has some kind of variation in how light or how dark it is relative to the other colors around it. I learned through mixing together colors that have varying intensities. So mixing some blue into some yellow and noticing that you need a lot more yellow than blue to create a nice green shows you that the intensity of blue is much different than the intensity of yellow. This has implications for how it appears as a value, as something that is light or dark or in between, all relative to each other. So the intensity of color refers to the color's brightness or saturation. This means this color is pure or free from dilution from other colors. The relationship between value and the intensity of color is pretty complex. They function as independent variables in your color. That being said, you can really use the intensity of color to help you create illusions of value and light. What we're doing in this color wheel is really just the tip of the iceberg of all the possibilities of how you can use color. It can be really helpful to practice mixing all of them up before it comes to actually rendering and interpreting your world into a painting. So next I'm going to paint in my tint tones. So I decided to split my tone ring into two so that I could paint in variations of tones. I included this because making complex complementary neutral tones, which are almost like neutralized pastels, these are personal favorites of mine. So this is a bit of an unusual thing to include in this color wheel, but I thought it would be helpful. So to make a neutralized color, we're going to actually reach across the color wheel. So to make a neutralized tone for this blue-purple, I'm actually going to reach across the color wheel and I'm going to grab some of my Indian yellow. So mixing a little bit of blue-purple with Indian yellow is going to create a beautiful tone, which means it's a color that's been toned down in terms of its saturation or vibrancy by mixing in a little bit of the complementary color. So at this point, I'm actually mixing a little bit of white in with my tones to make a lighter, more pastel version of this neutral color. So I recommend starting with any given color, any given tint that you already have on your palette. You may need to remix some of these colors, and that's fine. And then I want you to reach directly across the color wheel and take just a dot of its complement. So you'll notice that this neutralized light blue-purple, which is a tint tone of blue-purple, it's pretty gray. It's almost a grayed out version of this really light purple. So this is incredibly useful because when you look out into the natural world, you'll notice that it's pretty rare to see colors that are in the full saturation of the colors that you have straight out of their tube. But instead, colors are all being affected by one another. They're affected by the tonal relationships between each other. Color is bouncing around, or light is bouncing around, and color is reflecting from one object onto another. So colors are always affecting each other in nature. This is why it's really helpful to learn how to reach across the color wheel and grab a little bit of that complementary color from directly across the color wheel and mix it in. Be aware that the intensity of a given color is going to affect how much of it you need to add in order to create a nicely neutralized version of a color. When some people start to paint, they'll use just pure black straight out of the tube and white in order to create gray tones. I think that this is incredibly limiting. You'll notice as you're mixing these very specific chromatic neutral colors, which means they're neutral tones that are packed with chroma from different hues that are created through mixing complementary colors, that these chromatic neutrals are very specific and nuanced. These neutral tones have a much stronger relationship with the hues that they're made from, which is actually much more true to nature and how we see color. I recommend, if you're sitting in a room that has white walls and a white ceiling, to do a little bit of looking. So take a moment and look at how shadows are cast onto a white wall. Notice that these colors, they aren't just a stagnant gray. There is no such thing as just a purely neutral gray, but instead there's color in everything. So even things that are a gray tone have some kind of way that they're leaning into one section of the color wheel or another. This is really where the magic of color comes to life for me, is noticing that even in things that are gray or brown, things that are relatively mundane, like the white walls in your house, are actually packed full of reflected color and reflected light from the objects that are in the room surrounding it. So learning how to mix these really complex chromatic neutrals and then learning how to paint with them is going to be so helpful in actually capturing and also being able to see our world in this very specific nuanced way. So now that I have all of these incredible chromatic neutrals on my palette, I can't help but make a little abstract painting just to play with them. And I highly encourage y'all to do this throughout your color wheel process. See what happens when you use them transparent or opaque. See what happens when you load your brush up with two colors at the same time, and then create different kinds of brush strokes. See all the different possible marks you can make with this very specific color palette. Because these really light tint tones or chromatic neutrals are all pretty high on the value scale, this means I have a high key color palette. Notice all of the different color relationships I'm able to play with. I recommend playing with your colors just to see how different relationships evoke a feeling to you, or come forward, or recede back into space. The next thing I do is clean off my palette, because I actually had to start the next day to finish this up. This might actually take you several sessions, and that's okay. Take your time and be patient. So the next step in getting started again in this process is to mix up my secondary colors. And I start with my secondaries and my primaries. And to mix a tone that isn't tinted with white, I'm doing the same thing I did for my tint tones. However, this time I'm not adding white to the mixture. So this means for my quinacridone magenta, I added a little bit of the complement. I reached directly across the color wheel and grabbed a little bit of that secondary green and added just a dot of green into my quinacridone magenta. When mixing up these tones, I recommend mixing up the tones of the two complements at the same time. This makes it easier because I have the magenta and the green, and instead I'm just making variations of how much of each goes into my mixture, and then popping them in across from each other on the color wheel. For my orange, I reached directly across the color wheel and I grabbed a little bit of my ultramarine blue and I added just a dot, the tiniest dot of ultramarine blue, because it's a very powerful pigment, to my orange in order to make the neutralized tone that I painted in to the wheel. So the next step is for me to mix up my shades. So a shade is when you mix your hues with a chromatic black or another dark color. Here I just mixed up a quick chromatic black by mixing together my three primaries, and I popped that chromatic black into the center circle. And then I'm mixing just a little bit of this chromatic black color into each of these hues. Keep in mind that the kind of chromatic black you mix up is going to affect the kind of shade that you get. So there's so much possibility for variation within this color wheel. You could make endless permutations of different versions of this color wheel. So keep in mind that this is just the tip of the iceberg, even though you've mixed up so many colors. Now that I'm done with my color wheel, I had all this leftover paint on my palette, and so I had to see how these color relationships would work in a quick, playful painting study. I encourage you to paint playfully with these colors, especially because you've been painting in a really rigorous and structured way, to do a little bit of playful painting on the side as well, just for fun. It also helps to build some muscle memory. Congratulations, y'all! You made a very complex color bias wheel. This was a really difficult exercise, so give yourselves a pat on the back. And also, recognize that it's okay if it's not perfect. Mine is a very imperfect color wheel, and yours should be imperfect too, because it was made by a human being. So please don't stress about perfection, and I hope you can take a lot of what you learned from this process into your future painting endeavors. This way, you can refer back to this color wheel in the future, and when you're trying to paint from life, or you're going through a certain painting exercise in this course, there might be a certain color that you need to know how to make. This color wheel should set you up with the foundations of how to mix the exact color that you need. That being said, please let me know how I can help you throughout the process. I imagine that each of you will make several mistakes throughout the process of making this color wheel. I made plenty of mistakes myself and had to fix them. So if you are feeling confused at all through the process, please don't hesitate to reach out and we can set up a quick meeting. Well, take care and happy painting!